talk a little bit about the plasma membrane, and in previous videos we have talked a little bit about the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Here in this video we're really going to talk a lot about it in terms of how things are transported in this particular unit. So let's see and take a look at the structure and function of that plasma membrane. So it's structured in something called a phospholipid bilayer. Now this phospholipid bilayer, as you can see here, is pretty complicated, and it forms a strong barrier between the cell and its surroundings. Now it's composed of phospholipids and proteins. So we have here in this little picture, we have what actually is the phospholipid bilayer. We're going to go through each part, but this whole little thing right here, this cell membrane, is made up of phosphorus, it's made up of proteins and lipids. So there's a lot going on here. Now, what exactly is a phospholipid? Now, there's two parts to a phospholipid. We have this top part here. Now, this is basically a hydrophilic head, meaning that it's water-loving. It's polar, so it has a slight charge. Now, for you remember when we talked a little bit about water, how water is considered a polar molecule. It has a slight charge on one end. And this is something that we really need. We need this part of our cell membrane to, like water, because this will be the outside, facing outside the cell, and we also have a layer that's focused inward towards the cytoplasm. So it's really important that water is loved in this particular instance. So we have a polar head, and we also have a hydrophobic tail. Now this is water-fearing. This nonpolar tail has no charge, so it's considered a regular, a regular molecule. And this part is where water actually does not flow freely. Water, thankfully, does not go through here. We're going to talk a lot more about this particular part of transport in upcoming videos. Now, phospholipids organize themselves into this bilayer so that the hydrophobic tails don't come into contact with water. So because these polar heads are situated like this, the outside of the cell is up here, the inside of the cell is up here. So this way we have water on the outside of the cells, because water does go through other things, it gets transported in. And we have the cytoplasm, which is made up of a ton of water. So thankfully, those polar heads on the outside are allowed to touch the water, basically near the water, and that's okay. It doesn't mind coming in contact with it. So this is what your cell membrane is organized as. We have the hydrophobic tails inside, the hydrophilic heads on the outside, and they're arranged opposite each other, so those heads are on the outside that's capable of touching the water. Now, we sometimes mention that the cell membrane kind of resembles a fluid mosaic. Now, maybe in art class many years ago when you're a kid, you've taken a look and kind of created these little things, typically with tissue paper, although they can be made with glass, where you break glass and you place them in a pattern. That's kind of what this mosaic looks like over here on the left. Now on the right, this is now a cell membrane, and we kind of consider it to be that fluid mosaic model, partially because these proteins that you see here in the picture in purple, these are proteins that are embedded within the phospholipid bilayer. Now they do drift laterally, so they move fluidly throughout. So it's not that they're just attached in one place. They actually can move throughout the cell membrane, and this is also very helpful for upcoming discussions on transporting molecules inside and outside the cell, but not just yet. Now those proteins act as something called transport proteins. They transport substances inside and outside the cell membrane. sometimes the cell, these little substances are too big to travel through the normal way. So these transport proteins help them along a little bit. Also found along that cell membrane, we have carbohydrates, which will kind of tell you a little bit about what cell type it is. They could also act as receptors for chemical messengers. And also, some of these proteins that we see here are enzymes, and so they might help with a certain chemical reaction within the body. This is just a picture that we saw earlier, but this kind of shows you a little bit of everything that's going on. Like I said, it's pretty complicated. So just a quick review. We have our phospholipid bilayer here with those heads, those tails, and they're opposite each other. So those tails are inside, not touching water. We have these little guys outside. This is the carbohydrate chain. Could be acting as either a chemical messenger, could be saying like, hey, I'm this type of cell. And then we also have transport proteins and enzymes, which remember are proteins, and those are embedded within the cell membrane, and they act as either transportation or perhaps in a way for chemical metabolism. Now, the plasma membrane or the cell membrane controls what enters and what exits the cell, such as nutrients, waste products, etc., and even water to an extent. Now, these plasma membranes are selectively permeable, so it only lets in certain things and it only lets out certain things. So imagine a bouncer at a club. Sometimes they allow people in, they certainly let people out, but really that bouncer is selectively permeable, only allowing certain things in and out of the club. Now, I just want you to kind of reflect on this, jot down what you think the answer might be in your notes. The hydrophobic interior of the cell membrane makes it so only lipids and substances that dissolve in lipids can pass through. Now, take a thought, take a deep look at this question. No, that's not really a question, but this statement, and see how it might relate to your health. The hydrophobic interior of the cell membrane makes it so only lipids and substances that dissolve in lipids can pass through. How might that be related to your health? If you can tell me how this might relate to your health, I might just add a couple extra bonus points onto your test. Now, because of that statement, it really means that ions and polar substances like water cannot move freely in and out of the plasma membrane. Now, you'd think that water would be able to be transferred in and out, no problem, but it actually can't. And that's because of the polar nature of it. Now, lipids and nonpolar substances can move freely through that cell membrane. Now, if, for instance, that water, all cells need it, and sometimes it has too much of it. So it does need a way in order to enter and exit the cell. And that's what those transport proteins are. So substances that cannot normally diffuse across the plasma membrane can do so with assistance from transport proteins. And again, we're going to go more in depth with this in later videos, but know that there's two types. We have facilitated diffusion, we have active transport. So there's definitely ways for these transport proteins to move things across the cell membrane that the cell definitely needs, but can't actually do it through the cell membrane because it might be a polar substance or an ion, for example.